Good day and welcome to the second edition of our Euractiv Pro briefing covering energy, environment and transport. My name is Joshua Pisana. I'm the managing editor of Euractiv and I'm happy to be joined in our office in the event space that we have here in our main newsroom by the great Brussels-based team that lead our coverage on all things EET, energy, environment and transport. I'll introduce them in a second. In the meantime, one quick note. This is, of course, an exclusive briefing call that we're hosting here for the subscribers. So it's great to have you all tuning in online. We would love it if you would contribute questions, and we will get to those in good time on all things energy and environment transport. The platform we're using for this is Slido, and you can access the questions either by using the QR code, which is on the screen now, I'm reliably informed. Is that correct? Yep. Or by entering Pro Briefing into the search, and then it should come up, and I have an iPad here that offers me access to all your questions as they come in, and we'll get those to the team in good time too. So, just to present the guys that I'm here with today, we have Robert Hodgson. He's our relatively new editor covering energy, environment and transport. Hi, Robert. Thank you for coming.
Hello.
5 weeks in. Barbara Machado, who leads our environment coverage. Hello, Barbara.
Hi.
And Nico Koermeier, who runs energy coverage here. This is part of the team. We also have colleagues in Berlin and Paris too, but they're not with us here in Brussels today. However, in the future, maybe we can patch them in for another discussion in the third edition. Let's start, I think, with the big topics of the week and give our viewers and readers a sense, Robert, of the big ticket items that you are leading our coverage on a day-to-day basis. Can you just run us through a few of them?
Sure. Well, I mean, to say that environment and energy policy is in a state of flux in Brussels at the moment, I think would be an understatement. So everybody's well aware of the deregulatory agenda of the Commission at the moment and the fact that the whole Green Deal, which was adopted under the first von der Leyen Commission, is now being re-examined in the interests of competitiveness. So, I mean, earlier this week I did an interview, hopefully you've all read it, with Wopke Hoekstra, the climate commissioner, asking him about some of these things. I mean, he basically admitted that to some extent they might have gone a bit too far during the Green Deal, and now they're unpicking things, but maintaining, he claims, the same level of ambition in climate and more generally in environment policy. What we've seen today, though, is more evidence of the shifting political sands in Brussels. So we have a proposal for a 2040 climate target, which many observers, especially climate campaigners, were relieved to see contained the 90% reduction target that Mr. Hoekstra had promised, and which EU advisors had suggested would be the bare minimum we need to do to get to net zero by 2050. There were flexibilities added to it, but now the big news was that the Patriots for Europe group got hold of the file in the European Parliament, and that raises the question about the extent to which they might try to water it down further or block it. Who knows? There was a vote today which the Greens and the S&D and Renew groups all hoped would speed up the passage of the bill through Parliament and reduce the influence of the far right on it as it goes through. But that bill, as you may well have noticed, I think it was about 15 minutes ago, was rejected by the Parliament, so there isn't going to be this urgency procedure. So now it remains to be seen what happens. And I'll stop waffling in a minute and hand you over to my colleagues, but the big question here is it's all about the European People's Party, which you can say this in relation to a lot of the files that are now being re-examined because they hold the balance of power in the Parliament. The old cordon sanitaire between the centre ground and the far right seems to be dissolving and then reappearing and then dissolving again. So it's an open question now which way this file is going to go. Maybe my colleague Nico has some thoughts on this.
It's frankly astonishing to see that the EPP is content with using the Patriots as sort of a hired gun. So the way I see it, it's the right wing of the EPP is eminently unhappy with the ambition that comes with a 90% target for 2040. And because there's a sort of balance of power in the EPP. They're using or letting the Patriots dismantle it on their behalf. And I think this could be seen as a wider sort of quid pro quo between the EPP and its right-wing allies, where they are consolidating their cooperation and testing the waters of how far or how well they can trust each other to eventually form a more solid majority also on other files. Because if they can come to an agreement on a reduced green ambition in many files that they can work on here in 90%, the most politicized, the most controversial law, that means any future law is subject to EPP right-wing approval, meaning that, if I had to put it bluntly, it's Christian Ehler as the most prominent face. So he's the coordinator in the Energy Committee, German, been in parliament for more than 20 years, comes from Brandenburg, always tells everybody how he used to have more than 500 employees. It's this.
Brandenburg, the state of Germany, is a big farming area.
Not just farming, it's famous for encircling Berlin and nothing ever happening there. The point being is that this guy is essentially now the face of the wing of the party that calls the shots. If, and this is really a big if they can consolidate this alliance with the Patriots on 2040, because that's the testing ground. That's the real testing ground. Everything up to here, the last 1.5 years of plenary votes together with the far right, some of which were successful, some of which failed. I point you to the failed resolution with the 2024 budget discharge, where they ultimately failed to agree. This is sort of the real test on a very working level, because while this is politicized, this is going to happen in committee. These are environment lawmakers that are going to negotiate this. If they can work on this level, who's to say that they can't work on a grander political scale? And I think, and this is what I'll close with, I think 2 weeks ago we had this great interview with Manfred Weber, which we ended up titling "Who Can Stop Manfred Weber?" and where he was basically saying that given the fact that there is now a right-wing majority in the parliament, it reflects the voters' wills for genuine change. And he thinks of himself as the architect of that change.
Do you think it's fair to disregard it's a very large group, the EPP. For example, within the EPP, we have Peter Liese, their environment policy lead, who's been a staunch advocate of emissions trading and then carbon pricing, and has said he's very much committed to the 90% emissions reduction goal. He's also said that it would be impossible politically without adding some of the flexibilities that have been added to it, like allowing the use of carbon credits to offset domestic emissions. But I mean, you paint a very bleak picture suggesting that the EPP's already made its mind up here. Do you think that's the case?
I think the fact that the Patriots have the rapporteurship for 2040 suggests that the Peter Liese faction in the party, if we have to present a picture of Peter Liese being the most progressive on environment and the people around Christian Ehler being less progressive on the environment, then yes. The Liese faction in the EPP is so low on influence that this is a battle that they elected not to fight.
Just to also bring in Barbara on this issue as well. You're running, of course, the environment coverage, so this is another big sphere of legislation at the moment. How do you see the Parliament games working out?
Here, I think I have to agree a bit with Nico, actually. I think the EPP is trying to ride a bit this wave of the more conservative wing of the Parliament being in charge of a lower ambition and keep continuing to act as they still want an ambitious proposal when it's really not the case. But as we are seeing also with other proposals, I agree that they just want to let other groups dismantle the proposals because it will happen like that without them having to get their hands dirty too much.
What are the major files that you're working on right now, Barbara? And what's the status of their passage through the sausage-making machine of EU politics?
So also to bring up topics that are big this week. Yesterday we had a presentation of the chemicals omnibus, one of the chemicals omnibus, also with an action plan to support the industry. Here we see already an easing, like more flexibility in terms of rules for harmful chemicals, namely on cosmetics. So we start seeing a bit of the Commission's change of approach, which was already expected, of course. Also, we saw that the plan has other goals, such as having these alliances to find critical sites in the European industry that may be at risk of closing, and how can the institutions support here to prevent these closures. So we have that, but also we will have a second omnibus on chemicals later on in the year with the revision of REACH, and this is really the pillar of the youth chemical policy, and this is a file that is ongoing at the moment. It's being revised. It was postponed several times already, and in the last mandate it was actually shoved in a drawer because it's very contentious. There's a lot of lobbying around it. We have the NGOs and health concerned groups worried about further dismantling of chemical rules and making products more harmful for people's health and also for the environment. But also have the chemicals industry saying that they're at the brink of the collapse, that they have very high energy costs, etc. So we have these two forces fighting a bit. To my knowledge, the proposal for REACH has to be ready by summer, at least to go into internal review within the College of Commissioners. And only after that we will have it by October, November, or by the end of the year max. But so far, what we have seen is that the new goal of the Commission with this revision will be simplification, but previous proposals are actually adding even more burdens. So even NGOs are admitting that. So the industry is not very happy with this.
Never are, right?
True, but actually NGOs also admit that the criteria are actually adding more burdens and making everything more complicated. So we still need to see some more changes there. And that's mostly what's going on chemicals. Maybe I can just add that recently it was also announced that the defense industry will be a big part of this, and so it's a goal for these future chemical simplifications that important projects to produce armament in Europe should have more flexible procedures to authorize chemicals that are important for these productions. So we will also see more exemptions there, probably.
So we can add defence to competitiveness as a driver of deregulation in the coming years, then I think
definitely.
seems to be the case. Yeah. I mean, one thing that strikes me is, taking this to the sort of macro-political level, is that we have the democratic justification for revisiting, for example, climate legislation, of the groundswell in support for the far right of the European Parliament elections, for example. But at the same time, we have polls like the Eurobarometer poll, which was put out just before the Commission tabled its climate proposal. Presumably by no coincidence, the poll was put out and proclaimed that 80% of the EU population are in favour of ambitious climate policy. So if we take that, I mean, there's very high public interest in chemicals, in food, and in toys, and in plastics. And it's an issue of considerable public concern. So at the same time, you have a kind of a disconnect between what's happening in the interests of business competitiveness and certain desires of the public, I think, just as an observation.
Well, it depends on what you ask people when you poll them, right? Everybody's going to say, yes, I don't like global warming and I would love some more climate action. But if you tell them that that would entail 30% higher prices at the pump, that support melts away real quick. I think this is, I mean, to my mind, there's been research done on this. It's that voters predictably prefer non-invasive, ineffective climate policies, stuff like free public transport, etc., or investments into renewable production or whatever. None of these tangibly affect emissions all that much, while preferred policies like, for example, the 2035 combustion engine ban, very unpopular with voters, but would address a major issue in Europe, which is the fact that we're very much not on track in the transport sector, right? So to my mind, it's clear to me that this explains sort of the gap that you're spotting as well, that people love to say that they would like more climate action, but in the voting booth, they are like, no, actually it's going to be ECR in that sense.
You may sound slightly cynical there, but I think you probably have put your finger on one of the fundamental difficulties of environment and climate policy in general. It's everyone wants something to be done, but they don't want to do it themselves. What's the solution there? Any thoughts, Barbara? How do you persuade people? Do you think politicians have failed in persuading people of the?
I think most of all, people are not so informed about everything that is going on here, and of a given policy like the car combustion ban are only transmitted to people as a limiting factor, and they don't really have information about the full picture. And I think this happens with other policies. So the message that arrives to people is only one of you are going to be limited in your rights, in what you can buy, etc., but not the full picture of the whole environment policy that's being developed, because we are so far away from, like, this is really a bubble, and we are really far away from people's realities. And I think if this was a bit more transparent, the information got to people more easily, maybe there would be a bit more climate movements, because what we are seeing now is also a slowdown in climate marches and less engagement by people, and without that engagement, it's hard to make those voices that we saw on the barometer heard with more consistency. So right now, we only really listen to the lobbyists who are worried about their industries and not really the people that much.
When you say we, are you talking about the Brussels bubble, or we as reporters, policymakers, everybody?
I think everybody.
Okay. It's true what you say about the moment, the green wave of 2019, and which was built on the back of Fridays for Future marches and so on. That moment seems to have passed to some extent. It's quite
There was a great momentum at a certain point, right? Everything was heading in the direction of climate action, increased, ramped up green rules on everything from cars to chemicals. And it does seem that moment is fundamentally past now. There was an assumption, I think, back in 2019, 2020, that it was a pure ratchet effect, that once you increase these standards, they could never be reversed. That obviously isn't true now. To ask all three of you, maybe you first, Robert, is the Green Deal basically dead?
I'd probably have to say no. You have to remember, despite what's going on, that Europe is still, on a global scale, relatively progressive when it comes to environmental and climate policy. It remains to be seen how far this process is going to go. We've already had Patriots for Europe and Mr. Bardella, the French chair of the group, suggesting that the ordinary person, I'm translating from French, the humble citizen is just being harmed by all this climate action. There's definitely a need, I think, for policymakers who still support continuing on the route that we thought we were on 2 or 3 years ago, to communicate better, possibly also linking up the whole. We now have. So if we look at the start of the Green Deal and we think the big issue on the table was climate change and environmental destruction, And policy was, to a large extent, or certainly larger extent than it ever has been in Europe before, focused on those two problems. And now we have that problem still there, but next to it we've got defence and war on Europe's doorstep. We have deindustrialization, which is nothing new, obviously. We've been outsourcing production to China for decades, but now it's the big issue. And security, energy security as well, which is they're all linked together. And I think the case that needs to be made, and this is one that Commissioner Hoekstra was trying to make when I was speaking to him earlier this week, is that they're not mutually exclusive. Because if you live in a continent where we don't have massive reserves of fossil fuels, we were overly reliant on Russia, it's painfully obvious now, for too long for natural gas supplies. Now we're scrabbling to find other suppliers, and even if you take the US and ignore any doubts that some people might have about whether that constitutes a reliable supplier at the moment, it's still vastly more expensive to ship LNG in from America than it was to pipe gas in from Russia. So in some sense, you could say it's a no-brainer that Europe has to press on with the energy transition. There's a similar sort of dynamic playing out in China as well, because they're also short of fossil fuels, at least if you discount coal. And even then, they import a lot. So, yeah, it's not. We don't have the luxury that President Trump has of just saying, we don't care about the environment. We'll just drill for oil and live off that for the foreseeable future.
I think it would be useful to dwell on the international component of all of this, and maybe go to Nico on specifically on the issue of weaning Europe off Russian gas. Just quickly to remind our viewers that you are welcome to ask questions through the Slido platform. You can search Pro Briefing and the specific thread will come up, and we'll aim to move on to questions shortly. Nico, in the meantime, on the topic of Russian gas, is Europe's mission to wean itself off going well?
By some ways, yes. By some ways, no. You have to consider there's 3 levels of energy, right? Coal, oil, and gas, none of which we have all that much of, or do we produce any more all that much of. Coal went very smoothly. Oil, for the largest part, went rather smoothly as well, just because the global market is so liquid, and we have relatively few refineries in Europe that relied on Russian oil. These refineries largely continue to do so, and it's not amazing. But it's a minor issue in the grand scheme of things. When it comes to gas, we have 2 problems. Hungary and Slovakia being countries where much of the industry and also the gas grid operators have made very long-term plans to continue relying on Russian gas, to continue profiting off of relatively cheaply produced, cheaply shipped Russian gas. And that has, combined with a sort of vague resentment against the West and cultural, political proximity to Russia, has created a toxic cocktail of business forces and political interests aligning to sort of keep ties close, also through the traditional medium of gas pipelines. So that part is sort of stalling progress on that in a little bit. And the second part is, and this is actually arguably more egregious, is the fact that we continue to import vast amounts of Russian LNG in our LNG ports in Spain, in Belgium, in France, in Italy, sometimes in Croatia. It's just non-stop Russian LNG flowing in, simply because the industry is so reluctant to embrace new suppliers, to look at ways of breaking these old supply contracts. I mean, the best example is always the crazy example of securing energy for Europe, CEFE, as it's called in short. It used to be called Gazprom Germania. It used to be sort of the holder of all the tie strings, all the Russian supply contracts in Germany, back when the Russians were still, in 2022, seeking to inflict maximum pain. They tried to dissolve the company. The Germans had to last moment nationalize it, renamed it to CEFE. That company continues to hold long-term supply contracts for Russian LNG, and therefore the Russian state continues to sell LNG onto the German state. Yet, there's been a great degree of reluctance to break these contracts, even though it's obvious to you and me and everybody else that this is overt war financing. Like, that money goes straight into production of a variety of tanks and ammunition that will, in the worst case, be used to attack us eventually. Yet, and this is my last sentence, I think that there's been, and this has been much less sympathy for Ukraine and a much less genuine reflection of the European self-interest, the understanding that there's a non-zero risk of the Russians eventually attacking us next has shifted the tides, and I think we're currently progressing these legal measures to phase out these contracts. But, and this is again, this is complicated, there's always going to be businesses that are that hold a lot of reservations. They fear that they're going to be taken to court at various arbitration courts, and so far this is still stalling process once again. Let's see how that goes.
So let's just take in a few questions on this topic, because there's one that feeds quite nicely from exactly the point you were just making, Nico. Levente Takac asks, how do you see the role of nuclear in the transition? How can we end reliance on Russia and Eastern Europe gas, nuclear fuel, for example? What's your take on this?
I mean, it's a bit rich to talk about the role of nuclear in a transition that has to happen within the first 3 years. Like, if we have to talk about getting off of Russian fuels, and if we look at the time horizon for an eventual Russian attack on Europe, you have to consider by the time the Russians are projected to attack, let's say, Estonia, we won't even have laid the foundation of a new nuclear power plant yet, because construction times are so long. That's one aspect of it. So this is the age-old discussion of how short-term nuclear actually is. The second issue, and this is a much more pressing one, is the fact that it has proven really hard to get the, I think, 8 or 9 European countries, including Finland, but also Bulgaria, off of Russian-enriched uranium. Because we talk a lot about all that gas, etc., but on average we pay approximately, I think it's 900 million a year to Russia for its enriched uranium that we then fashion into fuel rods that eventually fuels all these Soviet-made reactors that they left behind in much of Eastern Europe. There, some companies, some countries have made contracts with Western firms, Westinghouse, etc., to replace that, but not all have done so. And it was supposed to be part of the initial legal package to phase out Russian fossil fuels, but because of significant reservations, mostly at the state actor level, this has been pushed to next year or later in the year. But at the rate things are going, we're looking at a process that is going to have significant impacts, bless you, only as early as 2028.
And you've been covering energy for quite some time, right? What's your take on this broad debate?
The issue of weeding ourselves off Russian energy.
And whether or not nuclear can be used as a fix.
Well, there's definitely two camps in Europe at the moment when it comes to the potential for nuclear to take over from fossil fuels. I mean, you look at the French-led nuclear alliance are pushing very hard for nuclear power, but there are the fundamental problem that Nico alluded to is that experience has taught us in the last decade or two that planned nuclear power plants take an awfully long time to materialize, if they ever do, and they usually come in vastly over budget as well. So it depends what kind of timescale you're looking at. I mean, I'm going to be slightly more, I don't want to use the word optimistic, but it's probably not a subject where the word optimistic really fits in, but let's set aside the possibility of a Russian invasion of Europe at some point in the near future and just take it as read that Europe considers Russia to be a hostile state with which we ought not to be doing business, whether they invade or not at the moment. Then yeah, it's worrying. I mean, you only have to look at Hungary for another example of willing reliance on Russia for their nuclear industry, because well before the whole invasion and everything started, the Hungarian state took a loan from Russian state banks to build a Russian nuclear reactor in Hungary, or two of them, an expansion of the Paks plant, which basically locks in dependence on Russia, both economically and from an energy point of view, for decades. So, yeah, I'd be slightly skeptical about.
We Austrians actually sued the Hungarians for that and lost.
Just a quick point from Esther Cantor, who has another question, but also a comment on taking this forward to another potential option is fusion energy. The first demonstrators come in 2027 in the US and China, and in 2031 in Germany. Fusion energy has been talked about forever, right? Are we really relying on those dates? Is this a feasible solution?
Fusion energy at the moment, but it comes from the sun via solar PV. And I think for a very long time to come, that's going to be our main relationship with fusion energy. I mean, obviously, it's become something of a holy grail, in the same way, and I don't want to be too controversial here, that it's the holy grail for energy production in the same way that carbon capture and storage is the holy grail for decarbonization. And fusion is even further behind in terms of development than carbon capture at any kind of scale. So, yeah, I mean, it's obviously worth investigating and working on, but the problem that we're faced with, both in terms of energy security and the need for an energy transition away from fossil fuels, the nature of the carbon budget and the level of average temperature rise we've already seen would indicate that to rely on fusion energy as some kind of deus ex machina to get us out of this mess would be unwise, I would say.
Maybe to stick with Esther and go back to her original question.
That's not to say that I don't think it can be done, and it won't be done at some point, but...
Okay,
you know.
Clear. Esther had originally asked, or made the comment, that she did not see the climate target pushback from the population, but noted maybe it was only in their own bubble. I thought the Commission turnaround was more of a reaction to the US change of policy and Europe's need for competitiveness. Barbara, just on the environmental side of this, do you have any real sense of what has driven in the environmental space the pushback to broader, greener targets? And then we'll come back onto the climate targets more generally.
I mean, yes, I think it was just the conjugation of factors. Of first, how the invasion of Ukraine led to an energy crisis that clearly shifted priorities or the speed with which we should do things, but also the whole energy crisis, prices crisis that has been hitting the industry and led to substantial pressure around the institutions, and to, of course, also the EU starting to acknowledge that the partners with which it has been relating to and on which it has been dependent, such as the United States, Russia, even China, are not that reliable anymore. And I think it was the moment when the EU looked at its industry and saw, okay, we are not where we should be. We cannot be self-sufficient in many areas, which is a fair realization. And I think it was a conjugation of these factors that is leading to this deregulation efforts. But also I just wanted to comment on your previous question on if we think that the Green Deal is dead. I actually think that on the environmental side, I would say it won't be dead on paper, but it will be dead in reality. Because what we will see is all the files that were approved will be changed somehow to make them either not applying to anyone or having no teeth at all, having no strict rules, but still existing to some extent with some broad considerations. That's the path I'm seeing.
If I can chip in on that one, because I mean, it should be noted as well that preceding the Green Deal, we had a lot of legislation in place to, especially in the strict environmental sense of nature restoration and biodiversity protection. We have birds and habitats directives, we have nature laws, and yet the EU has consistently missed its targets. It set itself for 2010, 2020, now 2030, we're not going to see biodiversity loss reversed, judging by the current state of implementation of those laws. So we've had laws in place that have been subject to fitness checks. Environmental NGOs have said these laws are fit for purpose, we just need to implement them, and they haven't been implemented. So in a way, the fact that a new layer of environmental legislation that's been adopted is being dismantled before it was even implemented. I mean, there was no guarantee it was going to be effectively implemented anyway on the strength of experience so far. So I think pushback against that aspect of green legislation is nothing new. It's just that now it's actually at the political level and the public level that there's a pushback against it, calling into question the very necessity of it or the justification for having it. That's I think a danger, because obviously if you start unpicking laws, there's only one way the trajectory can go from that point on, and that seems to be to loosen protection of ecosystems, the environment, air quality, everything, water. So.
And Nico, what's your take here?
On this broader issue, or particularly an earlier question, because it's not quite clear to me, but my take is always, and it's a tired take that I keep trotting out for the last 4 months, it's that the environmental aspects of the Green Deal are dead. Fair enough, they will be dead, and if they aren't dead yet, they will be killed. But it's the climate aspects which, in my mind, will survive piecemeal, at least partially. They're the ones that are much more likely to stand the test of time, because it's a much more genuine response to societal concerns at the time, but also continuing out across time. Because, let's face it, the climate crisis is people like to call the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis the two sides of the same coin, right? But matter of fact, only the climate crisis has been recognized by voters as such, much more so than the biodiversity crisis. And much of the climate law, the Fit for 55 package and all that followed, was a genuine response to voters' concerns about climate change. That's why it has proven much more resistant to any deregulatory efforts so far than the environmental counterparts.
It's bizarre when you say it, the Fit for 55 package, it feels very retro now. A lot has happened since then.
Yeah, Timmermans is no longer here for one, but you have to consider that the key aspects of the Fit for 55 package persist to this day. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but ETS 1 in its current form persists. That alone puts us on track for like getting halfway there. Then ETS 2, despite all efforts, continues to persist and hold on. And the time of its genuinely entering into force ticks ever closer. And then you have things like, well, all the rest has largely been ineffective so far, but nonetheless, it's there. So these laws persist, and these laws have yet to be targeted. Even if you look at the chatter around an energy omnibus, first of all, let me just point out, there's zero talk about a climate omnibus. Even the only climate law that was covered by the omnibus, CBAM, was speedily significantly improved, right? We went from 100% of companies covered to 10% of companies covered by, and reduced the efficacy of the law by only 1%. Amazing. And even when it comes to the energy omnibus, the laws that are on the chopping block aren't the clean energy laws or anything. It's the environmental rules like the Birds and Habitats Directive with all their pesky environmental impact assessments. It's not...
people for putting up windmills and solar farms.
And grid equipment and pylons and everything. But it's environmental rules that bear the burden of the deregulatory drive, not so much energy rules, aside from the RFMBO stuff and potentially the additionality requirements. That is very much potentially insights. And of course, last we forget, the methane regulation. The methane regulation is arguably the only climate law, and actually that's a great shame. The methane regulation is very much on the chopping block, and the methane regulation is designed to tackle the second worst greenhouse gas, methane, which accounts for approximately a quarter of global warming, and has a much more immediate impact than CO2. So
Very
actually,
good point.
I think that shows that only anti-CO2 rules have survived, because, I mean, the methane regulation was a pioneering world-first law. It is designed to sort of help eliminate half of global methane emissions.
And also, I suppose, designed with Europe's energy transition in mind, because, well, I mean, at the current level of gas demand in Europe, it would be difficult to accept methane only from countries whose upstream production emissions are low enough to comply with the methane regulation. I mean, one of the reasons it's on the chopping block now is because we're looking to America to supply gas. And the Trump administration has already made signals behind the scenes that it doesn't like this regulation and, effectively wants not to have to abide by it. I mean, and then we're talking about fracked US gas, which has enormous ancillary methane emissions in its production. So if it is watered down to accommodate imports of American gas, then it would be a triumph of political pragmatism over, I suppose, environmentalism. But it would also be calling into question the energy transition itself, because the whole idea is that we should be using less gas and moving towards electrification, and signing long-term supply deals with any supplier, having broken them with Russia or refused to sign new ones with Russia, extends the lifetime of the gas-dependent economy in Europe. So, I mean, when you say that climate rules have been relatively untouched, do you think that is a recognition that there is some truth in the argument that Europe has no choice but to electrify?
Good question. Very hard question.
Or is it purely altruistic?
I think there's no such thing as pure altruism anyway.
Cynical take.
Yeah, but I mean, come on, let's face it, already in the 90s, if you look at like the renewables white paper the Commission wrote in 1992, it already carries the recognition that we're an energy poor continent with very few natural resources here. We have to import much of our energy. It's not great. Renewables ameliorate this issue. That was the fundamental energy security rationale behind renewables. All the green feel-good stuff came after. So that's the one part of it. And the second part of it is that an electrified world, now that the technologies are coming online, they're gaining scale, they're getting better, they're getting more sophisticated. If you compare electric vehicles today to electric vehicles 10 years ago, people would think that it's a sci-fi movie, right? Ranges have gone up, costs have gone down, battery lifetimes 5-8 years longer than they used to be. Rare minerals much less necessary in the production of most batteries. The very tired cobalt trope is essentially phased out. Nobody uses cobalt in batteries anymore. So what I'm saying is that there's an energy security rationale, but also it's just so much more attractive now. Like, consider the fact that electricity or electrification of economy just increases its efficiency by a large gain, which means that the primary energy we have to consume and also the associated planetary heating goes down significantly. Most electric technologies are significantly cleaner, quieter, and just better for things like air quality or just quality of life. I mean, just imagine the future, a city where every car is electric and all the heating is done with heat pumps or other assorted clean mechanisms. No smog, no noise, some particulate matter from the tires of the electric vehicles, yes, fair enough, but...
Greatly reduced.
Sorry?
Greatly reduced.
Overall, greatly reduced. Like, I would love to live in a European city in 2060.
Very good point. Can we shift on to another topic?
Always.
Because I agree with you. I think the general green targets, whether or not it's good for competitiveness or not, the target is to create a city dweller environment that's very pleasant to be in. It's just very painful to get there. And I would say that maybe this is an issue where certain conversations were not had in a serious way during the formation of the Fit for 55 package about what the costs were going to be, right?
so let me just give this, because this is a long-standing grudge I held, particularly the German Greens, famous for saying that wind and sun don't send a bill. It's lying about the cost of the transition and acting as if this is going to be not a capital stock reduction or capital stock exchange instead of a capital stock addition. What I'm trying to say here is that this is, of course, won't be painless, and of course this is going to carry real costs. Our future electricity system won't be free. System costs go up in exchange for fuel costs going down. Overall, potentially it's still going to be cheaper than it is today, but not as much as some people may have led you to believe in the 2010s.
I got to stop you there, Nico, because now you're automatically going directly onto the topic of the next question, which is from Johanna Ronica, who asks concerning energy prices, the topic of debate just now. The Clean Industrial Deal aimed to lower energy costs for industry, but proposed few new measures for that aim. Instead, mostly recommending member states to implement existing ones. Where do you think the EU and its countries stand on the path to reducing energy prices? Robert, you want to start on this? We hand it back to Nico.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the fundamental issues facing Europe, because there are various ways to reduce energy prices. One of them is to make a massive upfront investment in the energy transition. And we're talking colossal. I mean, people have been bandying around terms since the first Green Deal came out, of the New Deal or the Marshall Plan. Well, I mean, the Marshall Plan, which you probably know is American money used to help with Europe's reconstruction after the Second World War, amounted to about 150 billion euros in today's money, and that's less than the annual cost, predicted cost of what we need to do to improve Europe's grids, deploy more renewables, and, decarbonize the economy. So you can't have it both ways. You can either head for a decarbonized economy, but be prepared to make the investment in it and then reap the benefits, presumably at some point in the future, or you can rip up the environmental rule book and start drilling for cheap oil. But the trouble with that strategy is you have to have the cheap oil to drill for. We don't. America does. So that's the path they've gone down for the time being. In fact, I mean, it's not something that began under President Trump anyway, because under the Biden administration, American extraction of oil and gas rose to record levels even before they walked away from the Paris climate talks. So I suppose it brings us back to the same point that we made before. I mean, it's all very well theorizing about, using cheap gas to power European industry, which we managed for so long thanks to supplies from Russia and Germany's openness to imports from Russia. If that option doesn't exist anymore, and it certainly doesn't at the moment, I don't really see that we have any choice but to electrify if you want to control energy costs, or at least stabilize them in the long term.
I think we're not there yet, in the sense that...
I didn't claim that we were.
No, but compared to what is required. So what we miss in Europe is what I would say is a sort of grand political energy union bargain. Because if you talk to... much more so, it would require potentially a new sort of European treaty, called the European Energy Treaty, because what we need is such large-scale surrendering of competences to the EU level, the 28 regulatory regime. We need such a strong agreement to boost interconnection, to improve antitrust enforcement in markets. Like, essentially there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 levers that we can pull to get down the costs of the transition. But all of them are so politically sensitive and have been resisted politically for so long that if we don't find this great political agreement that pushes this through, we won't do it. To give you a few examples, it's the fact that the Iberian Peninsula has a 2% interconnection rate with the rest of Europe. If we ever want to get prices down, we have to get that to 15% approximately. The French have long resisted it. Even now, they're very slowly letting in additional cheap electricity from the Iberian Peninsula, right? Secondly, the fact that
from the Iberian Peninsula?
Because they have the best solar load factors in the world, or at least in Europe.
I know.
One of the best in the world. Andalusia, solar power from there, some of the cheapest in the world. especially given that the cost of financing is so low because they have a very stable regulatory regime.
Say that some of that solar power would be welcome in Northern Europe if we only had a way of getting it there.
Exactly, yeah? It would be amazing. And at the same time, at night, we would love to have more access to Norwegian, Swedish hydropower. But the problem is, the Norwegians are much more opposed to that nowadays. They are looking at not extending interconnectors to Denmark in 2026. The political agreement is just not there. Look to Germany. The German single bidding zone, the unitary bidding zone, is one of my favorite hobby horses, is significantly impeding power flows in Europe, and it's causing misallocation of capital. Yet politically, it's absolutely anathema to the German political scene that this should be split up. Or take much of Eastern Europe, where they have been liberalizing their markets very slowly, where they have significant market interventions. Last I checked, Romania still bans power exports because they have such a weird national power electricity cost cap that they can't export, otherwise they blow up their own market. Look to a country like Austria, where market liberalization has failed so badly that everybody owns each other in the sector now, and prices are 10% higher than in neighboring Germany for new contracts. Let us look to Denmark, where renewables subsidies have gone so high that the price is one of the highest, even though they're rich in wind, and they would have. There's no reason that the price is so high in Denmark, right? This is all to say, and then let's look to the fact that there's, 18 power exchanges in Europe, all of which are okay.
For the stories as well, right?
Yeah.
Because you're making very good points.
Could I just intervene? Because we could spend an hour on this topic, but I mean, what you seem to be suggesting here is that the whole issue is a question of market management and rules. I mean, certainly you could improve the efficiency of the system in Europe, probably quite dramatically. I don't know what percentage you would want to put on the increase in availability of electricity. You could bring about by making everybody cooperate a bit more effectively. But ultimately, to drive the massive investment in grids and the huge expansion of production capacity we need, it needs a vast amount of money. And it seems to me that one of the big, I mean, we hear that some of the immediate the immediate barriers are permitting procedures and so on, but still the size of investment needed suggests to me that a huge amount of public investment is going to be needed to get this off the ground. Okay. And that's what's lacking.
This is a very good question that I'm sure all of the coverage is going to dovetail on and feature prominently in the coming weeks, months, and likely years. One more question, then I want to wrap it up. From Claudio Lanza. Looks like last century carbon-intensive industry is striking back against green emerging industry, effectively defending its dominant market share. Is it also because they won the argument on competitiveness? A very big picture question here. A very quick answer, starting with you, Nico.
One could see it as such, but I think it's an unfair characterization. There's no such contest between old and new, because it's all the same anyways. Much of the world of tomorrow will still require what was built in the 1900s. You have to consider chemicals, for example. We're always going to need precursor chemicals. That's traditionally an energy-intensive old world industry, but that would also be part of the new world. It's just the transition is very ugly.
Has the industry struck back, Barbara? Is the industry, in the end, vindicated for its opposition to the Fit for 55 package? Is that what we're seeing now?
Yeah, I think they were never abandoned, so to say. But once they had to respect higher standards, I think they won the argument of we shouldn't have to do that with the competitiveness argument. I think that's fair to say.
Okay, and Rob?
Well, I'd say the main driver of most lobbying campaigns in Brussels from the industry side is concern over loss of demand driven by policy. So this is why you see the oil and gas industry reacting to environmental policies that are built around the idea of shifting away from oil and gas and adopting electricity. So it's only natural, I suppose, for a company whose business model is built on the extraction and sale of oil and gas to try and fight against this legislation. We see lots of it. I could go into some of the tactics being used, which is more than the usual concern of, for example, the car industry.
That's a feature story.
We possibly could do that,
because the lobbying in itself, I think, is a fascinating topic around all of this in the car industry and energy-intensive industries. It's a huge topic in of itself. I want to conclude just with a round of the three of you. Robert, noting that you are relatively new in post as the Energy, Environment and Transport editor, you still have a lot of experience in this area, which I think any viewer would have seen oozing out of you through this hour-long conversation. Could you just quickly explain to the audience, not literally, figuratively, can you explain to the audience, just give a quick history of your experience covering energy issues in Brussels and beyond, and then we'll just go quickly to Nico and to Barbara on the big topics and stories they expect to be writing about over the next few days and week or so.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I've been in Brussels since 2013, and I moved here after covering general politics and news in Central Europe for about 10 years to take up a job as an energy markets reporter with a Norwegian firm. Which I did for a couple of years, and then I worked for an environmental news agency for 7 or 8 years, I think, covering environment policy, but also energy. And this was at the time that the Green Deal was taking off, so I've been in the thick of it basically for more than a decade. I did a year and a half as a senior environment energy reporter with Euronews, and then I've been at Euractiv since May, basically, in the same beat. Which never ceases to be fascinating, I should say.
No, and there's no sign of it stopping to be fascinating anytime soon, right? It will continue apace. Barbara, what are the big issues for you over the next week or two?
I think things will start to slow down a bit now. So all the big things kind of happened. But definitely I'll keep following updates on REACH before the proposal is announced until the summer, and also what will be big next week is the new MFF, so the new budget, how much spending it will go to environment, and yeah, I think that's the upcoming big news.
And Nico?
Well, you might have heard it already. I think it was in the newsletter last Monday. The Commission is secretly trying to basically centralize market coupling operations in Europe. And we've unpacked this a bit. It's a story few people care about, but they should, because it's the first step towards what could potentially be a European independent system operator. And that would be one of those fixes I alluded to earlier. And it's happening very much in quiet, but of course, we got our hands on the draft and we talked to some of the people in the sector, and I think we've managed to make the issue graspable. So look out for that in the coming days.
Great, that's a very good trailer and pitch for our journalism, which you will, of course, find at Euractiv.com. Additionally, the newsletter that you get into your inboxes every single morning, which is full of the kind of analysis, intelligence, and scoop-driven reporting that you've heard us talk about today. We look forward to doing this again sometime soon. I think these are useful exchanges between the team, and to reiterate, we've also got our colleagues in Berlin and Paris that we should patch into for broader debate about how the two big capitals see what's happening here. We didn't talk, for example, about coverage of animals, which is a big environmental topic, also issues around the car industry specifically, and how its competitiveness is being affected by the emissions standards. So there are more topics for debate in the not too distant future. Thank you in the meantime for tuning in, and thank you Robert, Barbara and Nico for joining us on stage here. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.